Greetings once again, Fanatical Dragon here once again, and delighted to be joined by another dragon, by Synthxia. Am I saying that right?
Yes, it's correct. It's correct. No, you got it right. It's good.
From Dragon Seek's Path, a spectacularly great YouTube channel that not nearly enough people are subscribed to yet. So please, anybody who subscribes to my channel, please jump over and subscribe to the Dragon Seek's Path channel. Amazing content up there. You've already jumped in with quite long form videos, which I think is super cool, and very passionately speaking about your love of action cinema, and specifically recently about your love for Indonesian cinema. So when I knew I wanted to sit down and chat about the Shadow Sprays, there was no one better in my mind to sit down and chat about the Shadow Sprays with than you. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Dragon. I first of all really appreciate the opportunity for you to just let me speak freely here and connect with you and other fellow like-minded individuals who are maybe coming from your side who enjoyed action cinema too. But again, just a little bit about myself. I've always been a fan of action films since childhood, and so when I, was exposed to Indonesian action cinema ever since I, took a university course before, that's kind of when my entire universe just, it just blew my mind of how far, action cinema can go beyond the limits, right? And especially when it comes to international cinema and specifically Indonesian action cinema, that's kind of like beyond, next level, just epicness, right? And so that's kind of why I felt, speaking on behalf of what we'll be talking about, the Shadow Strays, I felt like this was a perfect film to kind of dive deep into, especially when, you have The Raid, you have like Headshot, all those other very well-known Indonesian action flicks that have been out for quite a while. So thank you, Dragon, for inviting me once again.
No, my pleasure. I think it was really that video. I'm going to leave a link underneath to your little kind of I think you called it like my introduction to Indonesian action cinema. But yes. And you kind of mentioned like kind of finding, kind of experiencing The Raid through kind of, was it a cinema studies course?
Yes, it was like my second year. It was like a minors course, but yes, it was my very first time when I, was like, this is kind of what I've always wanted to dive deep into and understand. So that was a great course. I'm blessed that I took it.
And it was like day one of the class, right? It was the first.
It was kind of weird.
Wild, right?
Yeah, it's very wild.
Because I think we had, I went to film school, but we were at that point very locked into either just American cinema studies.
Right.
There was virtually no kind of mention of any Asian cinema at all at that point. A few of us dived into other areas, and there was bits of Japanese, but then it was just Kurosawa, and it was all the kind of big, sort of more like cerebral, well-regarded. And I think a few of us tried to bring in clips of action movies and things over our time when we were doing different exercises, and it was always beaten down by the lecturers. They just weren't interested at all, which was kind of a shame. So I thought it was very cool that your lecturer decided and got away with showing you The Raid day one. It's a good like line to draw in the sand for people to be like, if you're not in for this, you're going to struggle with what's to come, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm actually really grateful because I mean, initially speaking, like to be, truthfully honest, like I was not expecting there to be a lot of, graphic, violence and, a lot of that stuff that you would see nowadays, even in the John Wick universe, right? But I remember clearly just from the back of my mind, there was a scene in that film. And I remember I've mentioned this in my previous video where I literally was just scratching the back of my head and noticing I just turned around a little bit. And again, half of the class was gone. And so I think it's probably because, it's quite uncomfortable to kind of sit still and watch, especially for individuals who are very sensitive to graphic scenes like that. But for me, being somebody who grew up with, action cinema and, of course, wuxia, Shaw Brothers stuff, that kind of, I guess, prepared me for something like this because I was just sitting there in complete fascination, just thinking, oh, my goodness, this is badass. So I was just raw, like, right? It's different. It's very fresh, right? And something that I think, for a viewer themselves, they can kind of dissect it in certain ways. And there's so many ways that you can interpret it, right? So it's very subjective, so to speak.
Oh, completely. But I think you're dead on with kind of harkening it back to Shaw Brothers, because it's one of the things, I mean, for any of us who love Chang Cheh's movies, he was no stranger to blood, right? And I think it's maybe just the advancement in practical effects and in camera technology. And so I think that there's more of a kind of visceral reality to some of the stuff in Indonesian cinema that's maybe got a toe almost dipped in horror movies a little bit with some of what I hear some people describing of as gore. I never really read it as gore. Like, I think to me, never been comfortable with like the sort of Saw type or Hostel type, those sort of movies, where it's kind of almost like you're just kind of, those movies seem to delight in watching people suffer. And I've never got the same sense from the Indonesian action movies, and certainly from none of the ones that I'm sure we'll mention in passing, because we'll definitely speak about some of Timo's other movies leading up to The Shadow Strays, right? And I feel that kind of Gareth Evans really set the tone for what was to come, but almost kind of kickstarted this little micro revolution in Indonesian cinema. Because I think there had definitely been quite large, quite successful films in Indonesia before, but nothing like The Raid before The Raid came around. I think Merantau was just the straight pen silent movie that he made before, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which is really hard to get over here. So I don't think I saw that until well after I'd seen The Raid. But even it didn't really kind of go as far and as hard as he was able to do with The Raid. But I feel that was just like ground zero. And Timo Tjahjanto seems to have taken that almost like the baton in a relay race and just run so far ahead with it. And I think he came from a background in horror movies. I think like before he was making action movies, it was more kind of shorts and other kind of horror anthologies and things. And it definitely kind of feels like he's dialed everything up, even from what we saw in the two Raid movies. And so I think, I know that in your video, you kind of went up as far as The Night Comes For Us. And for me, I also really enjoyed Headshot, and even more so enjoyed The Night Comes For Us. I think Headshot feels like him finding his feet, and The Night Comes For Us feels like almost like okay, this is the voice that I've been looking to find, and I found it. And The Shadow Strays feels like the next evolution of that. And I mean, we've spoken a little bit about it, but for those people watching, what were your first impressions of The Shadow Strays? And kind of we won't do spoilers just yet, but just your first initial take as somebody who I know really loved Headshot, and I think you're on the same boat as me, where you enjoyed The Night Comes For Us more than Headshot.
Actually, I think, truthfully speaking, I kind of equally both like them in different ways, right?
Okay, so cool. Yeah.
For myself, I think when it comes to Headshot, like as you mentioned, it was more of like, Timo Tjahjanto kind of finding his ground, like, exploring a little bit into like silat and how, he can kind of work with cinematography in a sense, right? And tell a story. I think previously, I remember reading somewhere they call it the Indonesian version of Jason Bourne, right? Where the main character loses his memory. And then when it came to The Night Comes For Us, I mean, that's a totally different reaction that I had, but it was more action horror. It's kind of like a genre-based film, right? It's something that you would probably see, like if, I don't know, like Fantastic Fest would probably put up, at the time, if it were premiered there, right? It's definitely something that is within the realms of, genre cinema, and specifically action horror. And I felt that it really played a really huge part in, character development and the way how, you see choreography be taken to another level. So I think I equally enjoyed both of them, but just had a little bit of a different reaction to each. But I personally, I loved both of them. So that was just how it went for me.
And what about first time watching The Shadow Strays?
Oh, The Shadow Strays, the first time when I watched, I mean, I kind of knew based on my experience of Timo Tjahjanto's background in action horror, I was expecting that there was going to be a lot of, obviously, fight choreography and a lot of emphasis on maybe some blood and, hardcore, the working of the camera and things like that. But I remember when I first saw it, and I was just completely just blown away by the lead actress, and just how the first opening sequence was just... I literally just remember just pausing it for a few seconds and just trying to absorb that and just thinking, oh my God, it's beautiful. Because I personally, I just love the way how they designed the costumes, right? How they designed the characters and how they kind of, it's sort of, to me, like being somebody who likes cyberpunk influenced things or tech gear and stuff like that, I found that quite unique. It was kind of like a modern day Rogue or Ronin type of an influence. So I felt that was something very eclectic, but also very new. It's something that they would bring from, like, Japanese samurai films, influences of Kurosawa, into our generation, right? And so I thought that it was a very nice, way of delivering that kind of philosophical approach to the Japanese martial arts, and, using katanas and samurai stuff, right? And using also the influence of Timo Tjahjanto's background in action horror and emphasis of the martial arts of pencak silat, right? And how he works with the camera, displaying the choreography in that form. So all I can say was this film blew me away completely, right? And specifically, the way how it portrayed this universe through a female lens, or through the lens of female actresses, right, who are kind of in the sadistic world of, you know, men who are trying to dominate them and trying to control them, or, you know, go against them, right? So I felt that it was a very nice play in terms of that aspect.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I thought that kind of first opening kind of 20-minute sequence in Japan, which was all kind of, I think, before we even get the title card, right? And the title card comes up once Umbra's put 13 onto the plane to send her back home. I think at this point, I'm going to take that as your first beat, and I'm going to put enormous text saying spoilers ahead, and from here on we'll just dive in, right? But I thought that kind of first section in Japan and was so beautifully realized, and I'm a huge fan of they kind of did their own take on I'm trying to remember the artist's name. It's not Hokusai, it's the other guy. It'll come back to me in a second, but there's a massive mural with a skeleton. It's a kind of really famous piece from like kind of one of the old sort of 17th, 18th century Japanese artists. And it's normally kind of one skeleton, this sort of spirit of a skeleton looming over this group of people. And for the mural that they made up, there was two. And I'm sure that was probably meant to symbolize our two shadows that were coming into that situation, the kind of the instructor and her pupil. And the more times I watched it, I started noticing more and more lovely little intricate details. Like Umbra's using a full length katana, and 13's just kind of basically got one of the shorter swords. Is it Wakatashi, or can't remember, one of the non full length swords, right? Because she's not quite kind of graduated to sort of full level just so yet. It's kind of meant to be one of her sort of first assignments in the field. And I like that we got a glimpse of that shadow world, and in a way that I guess to a certain extent the first John Wick film did quite effectively too, where it showed you a little bit of this alternate world, but not so much of it. It was kind of you didn't really see that much of John Wick's world until parts 2 and parts 3 and part 4. Part 1, it was John Wick from that world interacting with other people who weren't necessarily from that world. And we kind of saw that a lot in The Shadow Strays 2 once 13 gets back to Jakarta and then starts dealing with basically kind of more sort of street thug or I guess criminal underworld rather than the people that are coming from the Shadows world. And I'm very desperate to see more of the Shadows world. Particularly, also really love the costumes they've made for them. I'm a huge fan of ninja movies in general, like kind of the old Japanese ninja movies. Not so much the American ninja movies. The Ninja Assassin with Rain is still pretty badass, but it was just really nice kind of seeing somebody bring that bang up to date and making it quite high tech. And there was so much inventiveness in that first 20 minutes in terms of like sometimes we went POV shots and like thermal image POV shots, almost as if like kind of first person, as if it was a kind of computer game. And the camera work, like you mentioned, was beautifully done, particularly when the camera mirrors the actions of the stunt performer, and then just basically started like a sponge trying to suck up as much information as I could, because I had no idea how ridiculously active Timo is on social media, particularly on Twitter, where he was literally responding to every single tweet that anybody was making about the Shadow Strays in those first couple of days. He was all over them, and sometimes he was elaborating on points. He was ruthlessly shutting down anyone who had less than favorable things to say, which was some, because a lot of people did say, well, this was No, the Night Comes for Us. And I think they are very different animals, really. They're kind of very different. They're very different movies. And I think there's one thing that he said that resonated a lot early on, where he said that when he was making The Night Comes for Us, he had basically effectively two martial arts masters in Iko and in Joe Taslim. And so any choreography they threw at them, they could do effortlessly, and they were often making up choreography really effortlessly. And so he was really intrigued by the challenge of taking actors that had no background in martial arts and seeing how would that be if we went kind of more to the Matrix model, where you train people up for a number of months and try and get them to do the work. And so they found, I'm going to have to bring up my actors' names. It's Aurora, is it Ribeiro or Rivero? Ribeiro.
Ribeiro.
Aurora Ribeiro, who plays 13. I think she was 17 when she was cast, which is mind-blowing, and about 18 when they filmed. Had zero background at all in kind of any sort of kind of practical martial arts or really any action cinema, but trained her up. But he said that she started doing a whole bunch of stuff without the production necessarily asking her, where she just intuitively started moving into this mindset where she realized who was going to be her kind of her main stunt double for some of like the big falls, like through the glass windows, or when she's getting hit by cars. Anything that you probably basically not that sensible to get an actor to do. The guy who was doing that doubling for her was also her main instructor. So she just started mirroring the way that he moved. So rather than the stunt performer having to try and adopt to how her performance is, she from day one was basically kind of trying to adopt and mirror the way that her stunt performer moved. So it meant kind of anytime they had to cut between the two, it was incredibly seamless. And this wasn't something that she was told to do particularly. She just sort of seemed to do it naturally. Learned to ride a motorbike, learned to ride a car for the production. Pretty impressive all around, and I think has done about 80 to 85% of all the stuff that's in the movie. The only stuff she wasn't allowed to do is, like I say, when she was hit by cars or jumping through plate glass windows and taking kind of fairly high falls. So yeah, I thought she was incredible, but not just in action stakes. She's got to carry the whole movie emotionally. Right. And there's a lot of beats that I think if you weren't invested in her character, it would make some of the sections maybe quite long if you weren't engaged with them, particularly when she's kind of gone back to Jakarta. And I think whilst there's a part of me that would have loved it to be more about the shadows, I kind of like that we're left wanting more. And he's spoken about hopefully going to maybe do another at least sequel, maybe a prequel or a spin-off from one of the other characters that would be more based around the shadows world. But I thought there was a nice balance where we kind of got the great section at the beginning, the little section, I think it's meant to be Cambodia, when we kind of see Umbra and going after the kind of rogue, you discover some rogue shadows who've escaped from the fold, which is another section that I absolutely loved, and we can kind of get to that bit too with Volver. Oh God, yeah, so good. And then the last little section when she kind of when Master has to go up against student has to go up against Master. So yeah, I thought I just like you, I'm completely blown away by it, and I think technically it's maybe elevated an awful lot of the things that he was doing in The Night Comes for Us, but it's a really different film with a really different energy, and cinematography here unreal, because every single fight looked so different, right? They all had a very different kind of feel in how they were shot and how they were lensed and how they were lit. So I tried to kind of break it down before I knew we were going to sit down. I was sort of trying to like, okay, what are the big beats? So we have our opening section, then we go to really the club section, which is kind of all heavily sort of neon lit and almost UV light in places. Yeah. And then to the boy who helps her out. His name is,
I think it's Jackie, right? Jackie?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Jackie's house would kind of with the police wearing their creepy plastic masks.
Oh yeah,
and they kind of go around, which was again almost slightly horror movie inspired, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah, and then from there to the warehouse, and then from the warehouse to that last absolutely bonkers reel in kind of sort of still kind of industrial into like places that looked like they might have almost been on a plane, and and everything in between, and each one had a very different feel to it. But yeah, I think I've watched it about 3 or 4 times now, and I'm still noticing little beats in each section that I didn't catch first time round. It's really intricate and really dense.
I think also too, I want to mention what I really absolutely loved. I think a small portion or small part in the first opening sequence is I think it's after when I think Tiga Blas, I think Agent 13, right? So the main actress, she after I think she was unconscious, I think, because she got shot, and then Agent Umbra came in. There's a part in when she starts to enter that I absolutely was just not expecting, was the part when I think one of the Yakuza guys or one of the triad people who were in there, he was just, I think he was like lighting something, and she's just right in front of him with like her cyberpunk looking type of mask, right? And so there's a couple of shots, right, that you can see kind of looks like a video game effect, like you're kind of like a first-person shooter type of games, right? And I thought it was very fascinating because it's like you're in her costume in a sense, or you're basically in her position, in her point of view, where you're trying to find your way out and you're trying to attack the other people who are trying to get to you, right? And so I thought that was a very nice, little hint of detail, and I think Timo does a lot of that kind of effect as the film goes along, especially with the car stuff and all the things that our Agent 13 kind of goes through, right? He has this really cool aspect of, having the camera. I think he attaches it onto like some of the actors or stunt performers. I'm not quite sure, but you're kind of seeing that momentum being played out, right? So I thought that was very interesting, and we don't often get to see that often in a lot of action films nowadays.
No, not so creative. And there's literally points where the camera will just invert completely, so it's upside down for a shot. So if somebody's doing a spin or a roll, the camera will follow with them, and he doesn't write it again straight away. He'll sometimes basically wait until the characters kind of manage to correct themselves, and then the camera will kind of almost follow the beat back round again. But for quite a few moves, you're kind of looking at the whole thing upside down, which is really cool. And I think he does it again when she jumps through the window. And that was kind of, it was a shot that I think Gareth Evans experimented with a little bit, but didn't take it to quite to the same sort of degree. When they first go into the kind of dealers, there's like a drug deal that's happening. I'm trying to remember if it's the raid 1 or raid 2. I feel like it is in the raid 1, but there's someone goes to run away from them, jumps through a window, and the camera operator follows.
I think it's the raid 2 when Eka goes through the one of the windows. I think there's a part where I think one of the characters, Eka, he basically shoots a couple of the bad guys down there, and then as you mentioned, he jumps through the window, and you can see the camera tilt, and we follow
because the camera operator sort of almost jumps through as well, and they kind of both sort of slam down to the ground in the same sort of pitch, and it works really, really nicely. But I kind of feel that that's all evolved, and I know that an awful lot of the stunt performers, and I think also the choreographer, worked on the raid, right? So Mohammed Irfan, I think, was a stunt performer when the raid was being made, and is now kind of escalated up to a point where he's now doing the choreography. So I think certainly an awful lot of the people involved in this have been there right from the kind of the inception of this kind of wonderful new wave of Indonesian action cinema. But I think all around the casting was incredible. But really, it's for me, it's kind of a 2-woman show. Well, maybe a 3-woman show actually. Because the girl who was playing the sister of the very first guy that she kills in the club, Haga's sister, I think she's
Gloria,
called.
I think.
She was incredibly good. Like one of my favorite villains that I've seen in anything for a while. Like, she was unhinged and demented and almost Terminator unkillable, where she got stabbed, she got shot, and she just kind of kept on coming. But there was a sort of wild, reckless savagery to her that was really compelling, right? So even, and I don't think you would necessarily describe her as one of the sort of main cast. She's just kind of one of the people that she's encountered. But so when I say 2-woman show, I'm really thinking of 13 and of Umbra, because both of them were incredible. And again, the actress playing Umbra was Hannah Malassen, I think. Is it Malassen? Yeah. And they're not that different in age. I think she's a little bit older. She's maybe about 10 or 12 years on Aurora, but did a really good job of kind of bringing a huge amount of world weariness and gravitas to Umbra in a way where you can tell that she's being tough on her for a reason, right? She's not. It's not a sadistic relationship in any way. It is very much that kind of old. You have to kind of basically try and make sure your student toes the line and does what they should be doing for their own good, right?
Exactly.
And I think that there's definitely a point when I think she realizes, without giving away too much of the beats at the end, that she's maybe not necessarily followed the right path herself, and maybe her student has come to a realization that this world isn't all it's cracked up to be before she has, and she starts getting pretty disillusioned by the Shadows organization by the end of the film. But I thought both of them did an incredibly good job, and they played really nicely off each other. So although we didn't have a huge amount of scenes when they're together, it's really only the beginning and the end. And then 13's out on her own for the kind of the bulk of the sort of second and third act of the film, until kind of the shadows come back in towards the end. But really, really cool. And I think it was nice getting that little, almost, I guess, breath of, or breathing room is maybe a better way to say it, away from 13's story when we flipped to Cambodia and got to see Umbra going on her other shadow mission, rounding up the strayed shadows, the ones that have left the fold. And I think there was somebody was asking about Volver, the shadow who is we find out is pregnant, which was also kind of heartbreaking too, when you kind of realized why they'd broken away. And there was a suggestion I got that maybe they're sterilizing the woman.
It could be,
because when when Umbra sees that she's pregnant, she says
Right.
like that's impossible, right? In a way that I kind of, my read on it was they're keeping them all medicated, and they're presumably kind of doing something to them that's trying to keep them in line, or trying to stop them from engaging with their emotions as much. Because I think it was the point when 13 stopped taking her pills is when she really started to kind of, I guess, feel more and kind of start engaging with the world a bit more. But a bunch of people had said that they were really heartbroken seeing Volver get killed, and Timo on Twitter was like, did you actually see her die? Because you don't, right? You see her go outside and there's that big massive huge enormous basketball player guy who they brought in as one of the shadows, who you assume had maybe dispatched her, but we never actually see that happen. So maybe we'll get a returning Volver in future installments. I don't know, but I like that we had that little kind of wee middle section where we got to see a little bit more of the shadows in action, and a little bit more of Umbra in action, because again, she's another one who had little to no action background or action experience, and wielded the sword with amazing skill. Like, she was very, very good. Like the sword fight, and particularly that sword fight between Umbra and Volver, I thought was fantastic.
Yeah, actually, I really personally, I like how you bring these things up too, Dragon, because I personally, for me, when I think after the film finished and I was trying to, understand certain, like mostly Umbra, I think her character was very complex, right? I feel like there's a part, I think it was earlier in the beginning when they're both in the tank, I think it was the car, sorry, the car, and Tigabla, so Agent 13, she starts, Umbra starts talking to her about, oh, you have to be very, stick with your job, don't get too distracted, or else, you'll end up like how you were, which was, she got shot, right? And so what I really liked was when Tigabla, so Agent 13, responds saying, oh, I'm more than just a number, right? So she's kind of that character who, as you mentioned, like there's this world of delusion where Umbra's kind of just, she's making sure she's doing her job, she's being the instructor, right? As you can only see 13 always referring to her as instructor all the time. I think it's a metaphorical way to tell audiences that, this world has kind of reflected a little bit in terms of how, people, there are certain individuals out there who are considered as numbers, right? And there's a reason why numbers tend to play a significant part in identities for people. And in a sense of like, how does one kind of break free from that, right? And I feel that Agent 13 is that character who is one with her emotions. And as you mentioned, she stops taking those pills. That's kind of when she's like, you know what, I'm a human being. Right, I'm interacting with the universe. I'm more than just, my job or whatever I do, an assassin, right? And it's like, oh no, we're tasked to kill people, but no, we have lives too, right? I think that realization that she has also, she brings that to Umbra like near the end, or I think that's kind of when they have their big, that big sequence that happens there, right? And so I find that a very, like, despite this being an action horror film, or any kind of film that a lot of people tend to see as more violent and gore, but I wouldn't probably consider it as gore, but more instance that I think it speaks a lot of volumes in terms of the idea of the character being casted as a number, and also having our main lead female actresses in there. How do they approach action from their perspective, right? So as you can, we've seen so many of the action films being depicted as, you have male leads, right, a lot of the time. And it's very fresh to see something like this, because, I mean, I'd say one of the most recent films that I remember watching in the theaters was Atomic Blonde. I think that's a great action film. I know we're speaking on the Shadow Strays, but that was something that started to generate more female empowerment, in terms of our generation when it comes to action cinema. But I think the Shadow Strays has so much versatility in it, where it's, it's not just action, but how does the action kind of reveal emotions underneath all of that, right? And I felt that Agent 13, she was kind of that catalyst for, Umbra, and maybe for viewers to kind of realize that, it's not just the universe full of, being disguised as, these group of individuals who are trained to become assassins, right? But they do have, like, lives, and that they do have emotions, but how do they deal with that, under these constraints? And I feel like Agent 13, again, she's that person or that individual who's kind of navigating herself through that universe, and it's kind of where the cinematography comes in. We have all those immersive scenes, right? And I felt that was a very interesting thing that maybe not oftentimes we may pick up on, but I think as you watch it a couple more times, you're just like, oh, that's something that I realize right now. And I think it's a film that'll grow onto you, and that you come to realize that it's a lot more than what you see, like, through the first time that you view it.
Oh, completely. There's a lot going on, and I kind of wonder if it struck you, because I was surprised that Umbra was called Umbra in a way where I kind of was expecting that she was going to be number one or number two, right? And she wasn't part of the number, but we do meet other numbers. And so when we met Volver's named, but when we met Crazy 14 at the end, had a small part, but she was relishing in the deliciousness of her insanity in a way that was really nice to see. And I think when I knew we were going to get ready to do this, I'd sort of I gave you a tiny bit of homework, we should tell them, because I wanted to check and see if you'd seen any of the Baby YQ or the Baby Assassins movies, right? And you hadn't had a chance yet, so I kind of sent over a copy of the first Baby Assassins for you to check out. And I think I'm a little bit older, and so I've when I was kind of growing up, but you grew up watching Shaw Brothers too, and I think there'd been that kind of point in Shaw Brothers history when all the leads were female.
Yeah. And
there was this incredible time when Cheng Pei was really, she was the queen of Shaws for quite a long time. And then Chang Che really was the one that in the kind of the very late 60s, early 70s that started moving things towards male leads. And that trend really kept on going for a long time, really until I think probably until Michelle Yeoh and Cynthia Rothrock started kind of giving us, well, not just then, there was an awful lot, Moon Lee and Hong Kong cinema's always been a lot more comfortable with the idea of having women kicking ass alongside men and often bettering them. But America's been a little bit slow to the uptake on that. And this is Shadow Strays is ultimately a Netflix funded film. So I do think it's particularly now, it does feel like something that's quite exceptional, where it's a very well realized action movie centered around female leads. And I think Hollywood has been quite quick to try and force that to happen away, and has been heavily criticized for it, where they've been, I know that they've kind of, there's been the, they don't call it the MCU anymore, they call it the MCU in amongst the kind of the guys who make a living bitching on Marvel and Disney movies on YouTube, which I'm not really my thing, but certainly there's an awful lot of kind of female characters in the Marvel movies, but never really given the same degree of agency that we see here, and never as well written in a way that the characters feel so tangible, where they're almost, it's kind of almost matter of fact that their gender is kind of an afterthought. Like, because you could have absolutely made this same movie, I don't think it would have had as much impact, but you could have made the same movie or the same story, The Shadow Strays, with a male lead instructor and a male student, or a male lead instructor and a female student. I think in much in the way that the very original first Alien movie worked, where when those parts were written, it was written in the script, character can be either male or female, and they just happened to make Ripley a female character, and history was made, right? So I think, not to take away from the fact that it's two female leads in the center of this, but I think there has been this kind of undercurrent of really strong female characters in quite a lot of action cinema over the years, and I'm glad that Indonesia is getting its turn to do that. And this is a very long setup for saying kind of why I wanted you to watch the Baby Assassins movie. It was because Japan's been doing that a little bit more consistently for the past couple of decades, and has really found its groove with that Baby Assassins series. And I think I've started you with the first one, and I can't wait till you get to number 3, because number 3 is the much more action forward, action focused. One's a weird mix of like part comedy with a little bit of action, and the choreographer there, Kensuke Tsunomura, was kind of still sort of finding his own particular style and his particular groove, which is very different to what we're seeing in the Indonesian stuff, and it really comes to the fore in the third one. So once you get around to seeing the third movie, I think your mind's going to be blown in a different way, because it's very different to the Indonesian style. It's not quite as kind of bloody, but it's got a very different flow to the choreography that I can really enjoy, and I think it's going to be interesting. We can do a follow-up once you've come. Let's pop a date in the diary for a month or 2 months, maybe just into the new year, and we'll do like a Baby Assassins roundup, right? Because I'd love to know what you think of 2 and 3, because they're each of the movies have very different energy, and I think one's a mix of action and comedy, 2's maybe a little bit more comedy with a bit less action, and 3's almost all action with sprinklings of comedy here or there. And 3's my favorite, but 3 was one of my favorite movies of the year. But I think maybe possibly enjoy The Shadow Strays slightly more. It's a hard call. But anyway, we'll save that bit for another. But anyway, all this is a digression to say I think it's very kind of cool seeing really well written, well crafted parts for women to kind of have the chance to play, right? And I think there's no reason why we shouldn't see that more in action cinema. I kind of given up on America really as being able to do that. A little bit, right? I think I still hold out hope. And I loved the first 3 John Wick movies. The 4th John Wick movie, there's bits of I love, but I still prefer 3. And weirdly, I prefer 3 because of Halle Berry's character. I thought she was much. She was given much more to do than we saw Donnie Yen getting in 4, and I thought 4 felt a bit too vignette-y, but I have high hopes for Ballerina. I'm hoping that that's going to kind of basically be, I hope good, but the signs are, I'm worried already by the fact they're doing so much reshoots and stuff like that, and Chad's kind of had to come in to sort of, I suspect, reshoot an awful lot of stuff to try and up the level of the action, but that's a different conversation for a different day. I think Netflix is actually much better in terms of pioneering and giving us really strong female characters. Did you get a chance to see Ballerina, not the John Wick Ballerina, but the Korean movie Ballerina?
I've only seen snippets of it, to be honest. I remember having like a preview. We had like a small preview before in like a cinema course, like a while ago. I went back to kind of just revisit, and I remember sitting there, and I wasn't able to sit through the whole screen, but I think I saw snippets of it. But I heard it was pretty good, if that was correct.
No, it's really good, and it's good in a different sort of way where it's not as action forward. There are certainly action beats in it, but it's a kind of much better, almost, I guess, kind of almost like I guess it kind of plays out a bit like a murder mystery in a way, where there's the main character's trying to find out why her friend is, spoilers for Ballerina, why her friend has kind of committed suicide, right? And there's a story underneath why her friend has done this. And her friend leaves her a note basically saying, like, avenge me. And so she's got to kind of go and try and work out what's happened. And she kind of discovers why her friend was kind of forced to take her own life and kind of what happened, and she digs deep into this pretty nasty, pretty seedy underworld, and she's another very capable character. I think she's meant to be someone who's martial arts trained, who's doing like private security for people, but she's kind of very physically capable, so she it kind of goes into most of the fights that are in that movie and will always come out on top unless she's massively outnumbered, and even then she can kind of come out on top. But I think kind of Korean action is its own different kind of animal, but again they give loads of opportunities to kind of female actors in a way that I think America just doesn't seem as able to do. And I think it's more of a fundamental problem with American script writing, particularly more because there's a huge bunch of very talented actors and actresses and filmmakers in America, but for some reason the scripts that go through don't seem to I think they all seem to kind of try and follow a formula more than we see in cinema that comes out of particularly out of East Asia, where the story seems to be king over there, where the story is more important than following a particular formula of another film that worked a couple of years ago. So it doesn't feel so bandwagony. American cinema always feels like that thing did really well, so we've got to do that thing too, right? And I think they will definitely break that cycle, I'm sure, at some point. I'm kind of rambling and going in circles, but I'm getting us a bit away from the Shadow Strays. But I think to try and bring us slightly back inwards, I think that we are getting, or in fact, I can connect the two. Yes, I can. Timo's doing an American movie. Timo's doing Nobody 2.
I think so. Yeah, I remember hearing that, something about that. Yeah, for sure.
And so it'll be interesting. To kind of see how he works in that sort of environment with a bigger budget, because that's the other thing we haven't had a chance to mention yet. The Shadow Strays cost nothing at all. Like he was, people were asking about the budget, and he'd said that he had 1/10 of the budget of Twilight of the Warriors, and Twilight of the Warriors had a budget of 30 million US, about 300 million Hong Kong. And it was a spectacularly expensive movie in Hong Kong terms, right? It's why I think it struggled a bit to take its money back. But Timo said they had 1/10 of that. So I'm putting the budget as somewhere between 3 to 4 million US, which is tiny. That's not even the catering budget on, or that's like Robert Downey Jr.'s wardrobe budget on a Marvel movie. That is a minuscule amount of cash. And for the fact that they were able to do so much with so little makes the whole thing even more impressive, really.
For sure.
And I hope increases the chances of him getting another bite at the apple, another chance to visit this world again. Because I think, but I felt the same about The Night Comes for Us. I felt, there's a part of my heart and my head desperately praying to the movie gods that we get a Julia Stell operator spin-off from The Night Comes for Us, right?
For sure.
Because it was so set up to do so, and there was a deleted scene that I think he called attention to the fact that the deleted scene had been up on YouTube for a few years and no one had noticed it was there. Because the deleted scene of...
Okay.
I'll send you the link.
I didn't even realize.
I didn't either. It was until he posted the link.
Goodness.
He said something like that day that people realized this has been up for like 5 years.
Goodness.
It's like a scene of Julia Stell going to her arms dealer / handler.
Oh, okay.
and basically retooling up and kind of reloading up. And everything about their kind of discussion sort of suggests that there's a bigger world that she's part of that we're going to get to see more of. And I think he's a relentless tease, Timo, because he put out pictures really recently of him meeting up with Julia Stell, and he just got her to put on her outfit from...
Oh my goodness!
From When It Comes to Us, and he was like, outfit still fits," and she's
don't bait us.
I know, it was complete. I was like, "God damn it," because I haven't seen her doing anything for a couple of years, but she was so incredibly good in that. And there was part of me at the end when the character came in a motorcycle helmet, which ended up being Jahan from the Raid. Jahan Ruin. But it's exactly the same helmet that she was wearing. So when I first saw the helmet, I was like, "Is this Julia Stell?" And he flipped up the helmet. I was like, "It's not," but still, yay! It's still good. Someone I'm happy. Yeah, it's still someone I'm happy to see. But I didn't know if he was going to bring those two worlds together, and if this was going to all form a bigger Timo verse where everything was sort of interconnected. I don't mind if they're separate, but I do still hope that he'll maybe get a chance to do another Night Comes for Us. But I feel that the longer time goes on, the less likely that is to happen, and maybe a Shadow Strays sequel that maybe has Julia Stell in it is maybe more likely. Because it certainly leaves things quite open. That ending begs for a sequel, right? More so than we saw in The Night Comes for Us.
Yeah, no, I think Julie, I mean, going back to that film, it was just, again, these films, most of them have blew my mind all the time, even if despite the amount of times I've seen them. But I remember just, seeing her from Headshot to The Night Comes for Us and even The Raid, like just the evolution of how, her characters have grown and how she kind of fits. To me, I've always seen her as one of those completely underrated but well-deserving actresses who should just, play the leads in most of these films, right? And I felt that she really carries a lot of that aura, of being, that one who just steals the show, right? Despite the films being quite male-dominated, right? And these fights are often very, very male-dominated. And I find that, she just has this way of not saying too much, but she's able to deliver the action in the perfect way, right? It's just completely mind-blowing. Just every time seeing her, I'm not surprised, because I'm like, it's Julia Stell, right? She can really deliver kick ass and do so many things that I find that, really it's different. It's empowering in a way I think for female viewers. But I also find that, having female, even if it's a supporting role or even if they're leads, right? You can really show you how versatile, the story can be, and how choreography is different or can be adjusted, right? Depending on, their capabilities. And I find that, regardless of the style or the kind of, martial art that's being portrayed, it varies, right? Based on the practitioner or even based on the actresses, right? And I find that, having them in these kinds of films, we're able to see how far the choreography can go from their point of view or from their standpoint, right? And so I find that, when I saw Julia Stell, when she popped up as the operator, I literally stood off of my chair, and I was just like, oh my goodness, seeing her fight Joe Taslim as Ito it was amazing, and again, bringing us back to the Shadow Strays, that entire world where we see Agent 13. I can't believe how young she was. I honestly was not expecting her to be so young and to learn all this choreography, right? It's quite painful in a way, because if you were to kind of, train under all of the circumstances, but of course, I found that the way how she kind of moved and how the camera moved with her, she kind of carried this innocence in her, but she had this charisma as well, right? She was very, very much in her own universe in the way how she portrayed herself versus Umbra. It was, to me, I think that meant a lot to me more compared to just the action itself, because it was about the characters, right? And I found that how she kind of portrayed herself in a sadistic world, right, was so unique. It was something that I would have never expected, coming from the movies that we often see nowadays, right? And so I thought that this movie really brought a lot of that flavor with our female leads, for sure.
Completely. And I think there was you're definitely right, because I think there was a time I kind of beat on it, was when she's totally unarmed, because at the beginning she's so protected in her armor, and I think and uses that so beautifully well, and particularly the kind of the sort of arm gauntlets that they have, they're kind of using to kind of block weapons. The bullet dodging was unreal good in a way that's still kind of sort of totally believable. You don't kind of watch it and think you're seeing the Matrix where they're doing something superhuman. It was just like, okay, they're untrained to an unbelievable degree to like watch people's hands when the trigger's being pulled or whatever, but I just went with it, right? It was great. But when she was unarmed, there was this amazing sort of vulnerability to her, and she was often taking a lot of shots, and she's not like she was an invincible fighter, so really easy to empathize.
Exactly.
But when she gets a blade, God damn it, there's a savagery to her where it was just like she was shitting people like it was some sort of horrific prison movie. Because like she wouldn't just stab someone once; it was literally just
I remember. I think it was like one of the club scenes. I really liked that part. I think it's before. I think when her, Jackie, and he was trying to save one of the women who were working there. There's a part where I loved how the camera just shows us that security camera, and you can see she's beating the crap out of all these dudes in there. And I remember seeing that one part when I think it was they're trying to leave the club, and then she's just like, hold on, guys, I got this. And she's just stabbing all those people, with their weapons and stuff. And I thought, she's unarmed, but she's really showing what she can do, right? And I feel like that's technically, like, that's so different compared to what you would see, like, nowadays, right? And I thought that, it's kind of like, it's her world now, outside of the Shadow Stray, she's in the real life, in the real world. And how is she kind of putting herself out there, without the gear that she often has, right? And so when they took off her helmet in the intro scene, I was like, technically, I think most viewers would not expect that it would turn out to be a female, right? And that's kind of when the character's like, oh, it's a female assassin. You're just like, oh my goodness, right? So I think that was something very special that this film definitely shined a lot of light onto.
Yeah, and it kind of kept me guessing the whole time, where it didn't follow an awful lot of the beats that because we haven't really seen a world like this presented like this before. Yeah. But even to the point where I found myself wondering when the geisha arrives at the beginning, I was like, okay, is she also going to turn out to be like kind of someone who's going to be there, or is she the first shadow that we're seeing? Yeah. And it completely flipped the script on me, really, because ultimately the reason why she gets shot in the first instance is because the Yakuza guy moves at the last minute. Yeah. And she ends up kind of against her decision shooting the geisha. But by the time that she realizes it, she shot her like 3 or 4 times. It's not like a single shot. Yeah. Like, kind of that sort of brutality and everything that the shadows do is kind of evident even there. And there was this amazing kind of repeating motif of, partly because of the way that the geisha lands. So when she comes to again, she's sort of looking at the geisha lying side on, and that parallels to the memory that she has and she keeps seeing in her dreams of her mother, and was also kind of really nicely used to connect her with the young boy, where she was basically using that as a way of, this is how you speak to your mother who's no longer here. And there was a lot going on in a way where at first impression it could seem like quite a simple, relatively straightforward story, but I feel there's an awful lot of layers going on. So I think it's going to be something that I'm going to love revisiting. I wish, part of me wishes it wasn't on Netflix, right? I wish I could buy the disc for it, right? I could buy the disc for it, and Timo would sit down and talk through and do a commentary and all that good stuff that we get when we buy DVDs and Blu-rays. And it's the one thing that I don't like about streaming is the fact that it denies us the extra kind of, I guess, the extra content or the extra bonus features that we've become used to on DVDs. And it's one of the things I love about the Raid movies is you can go back and listen to Gareth Evans speak about what he was trying to do, and it helps you understand their intentions and also just the filmmaking behind it. And I would love to know kind of more of how Timo comes up with things, because each one of his films, and I'm glad that you kind of said you kind of don't really rate one over the other with Headshot or The Night Comes for Us, because all of his films are quite they're all within the same wheelhouse of being action, but they are all quite different animals. And I recently watched, I hadn't seen The Big Four before seeing The Shadow Strays, but I went back and watched The Big Four afterwards, and that couldn't be more further away from The Shadow Strays again in terms of tone, where it's almost like a kind of goofy, I guess, Wheels on Meals era Hong Kong comedy action movie, where so many more of the beats there are played almost like slapstick comedy, but in a way that felt really familiar to me, of like Stephen Chow, or of kind of like that era of Jackie Chan, kind of I guess even maybe the Lucky Stars movies, where it had that some of that goofiness, but with his same brutal, really over the top
brutal flavors in there.
Yeah, completely. Because I think that's always going to be something that's evident anytime that he makes anything, and he's been asked about it a lot, right? Because a lot of people do say, "Wow, you got your stuff so gory," and he's like, "I don't see it as that. But if you're going to show violence, you should show the consequences of violence. And if someone gets stabbed or shot, there isn't not any blood." And if you'll bear with me for a tiny little tangent, years and years ago at a film festival, I saw this great documentary called "This Film Is Not Yet Rated."
Okay.
And if you ever get a chance to see it, or if you're ever in a situation where you have to suggest a documentary for a class or whatever, try and get them to screen "This Film Is Not Yet Rated."
Okay.
It's phenomenally good. It's made by this guy called Kirby Dick, who came over and introduced the film when it played at the film festival here. And it's basically about how the MPA work, MPA or MPAA, anyway, how they work and how the rating system works in the States. And he basically tries to get his documentary rated while he's still kind of making it. So part of the documentary is him trying to get it rated, and seeing how that whole process works and how horribly corrupt that system is, and who it is that's determining the ratings. Anyway, he interviews a bunch of filmmakers in the course of making the documentary, because he interviews the actors from The Cooler, because The Cooler was an independent movie and it had problems getting its rating, but big, massive, huge budget films for huge studios can basically get whatever rating they want to pay for. The point of telling you all this is, at one point he goes to speak to Darren Aronofsky, the guy who made The Wrestler and The Fountain and Black Swan and Pi and God Requiem for a Dream, so many other amazing movies. But he says that he thinks the rating system's completely backwards, where he's like, if you show violence, he says like something like Saving Private Ryan should be universal, like that anyone should be able to see that, because you see the really visceral, graphic effects of war and how horrible it is, and there's limbs flying everywhere, and it's really traumatic, and it's quite tough to watch at times. Whereas something like Transformers or a Marvel movie, where there's no blood and there's no consequences, and often even no death in those movies, should be like rated hard R. Like you should be, basically your brain should be in an adult place before you're allowed to see what's essentially fantasy. And I think
I see.
Because it's not real. And I think what Timo was doing is in a way much more actually realistic, to a point where if somebody was stabbed or they were shot or they were had a rocket launcher shot at them when they were in a car, or whatever other craziness, or they were set on fire, or that whole section with a wok full of burning hot oil, which was grisly, right? But I think it's more honest to see the consequences of that, and you never get the sense that he's using that for titillation. He's not trying to make you being like, oh, this is so awesome seeing people getting fucked up, right? It's never that. And I think it's always basically about, like you mentioned, it's about the character and what the character is going through. And it's horrific sometimes seeing the consequences of these things, but I think it's kind of better that way. So I think it's a more honest and maybe slightly more responsible way of making action. Because I've seen a bunch of action movies that don't have any consequences. Even I guess to a certain extent, the John Wick movies aren't particularly graphic in their gore, and he's shooting hundreds of people. And I love those movies, right? Don't get me wrong. But the body count that he goes through in those movies is insane, and there's never any kind of like really. He's not going through any inner struggle or feeling bad.
I would say the only consequence is seeing John just fall down a bunch of stairs.
Basically, and
just limping, But otherwise, for sure.
Yeah, and I love those movies, and I'm all in for them. But I think they are kind of a very stylized type of action. And I think I mentioned Ninja Assassin way at the beginning of this chat, and Ninja Assassin was one that did actually try to show a little bit more of the kind of gore effect. And I think by the end of that movie, Rain is absolutely ripped to shreds, and everybody around him is too. There's a lot of blood, admittedly CG blood in that movie, but but I think it's kind of good. I think he strikes the balance really well. So I'm really intrigued to see how this wave continues to unfold and what we're going to get out of Indonesia next. I think I sat down with another friend of mine just a week or so ago to speak about the Indian movie Kill.
Oh, I've seen that. Yeah.
And that's kind of weird, in a weird sort of way. I feel that that's almost like an Indian response to everything that we've been talking about, because it felt, both of us came to this realization that it didn't really feel like American action movies. It didn't really feel like Hong Kong action movies. It really felt like Indonesian action movies, because it wasn't so about a really defined style in the way that kind of Hong Kong cinema was so much about technique. And did you see Twilight of the Warriors?
I have, yes, I did get a chance to see Twilight Wars. I just have to rewatch it again because
there's a lot
to take in, and I need to kind of pick up on so many things. But yeah, for sure.
Because they were, and it was Kenji Tanigaki, the wonderful Kenji Tanigaki, who was doing the choreography on Twilight. But it very definitely was very aware of the legacy of Hong Kong cinema, and he's actively doing all kind of Hungar moves and the almost spiritual boxing from the Shaw Brothers movies. All that stuff was coming back in, right? Because Hong Kong cinema fans love those styles, and so when you kind of see them in movies, you're like, yes, that's kind of something that's part of the fun, right? But I feel that kind of the Indonesian stuff has moved a little bit away from what we saw with Penkat Silat and the Raid movies into this more sort of brawling, less style defined and more just kind of, I guess, action and character orientated. And I felt that Kill really lent into that aspect too, where you could never say that he's a particularly graceful fighter in those movies. It's again also still taking some beats from horror movies in the way that it kind of unfolds its action. So I'm really fascinated in seeing what happens in India too, because that was so unlike any Indian action movies that I'd seen, and I loved it. I think because it reminded me so much of Indonesian cinema. And I don't know if you've seen I hadn't seen that many other Indian movies before, Indian action movies, because the ones that I had seen before, I really couldn't get. Like, I tried watching RRR, which I think was like the big, massive, really successful one, and almost impenetrable to me. It was so like CGI heavy, and very, very Bollywood in a lot of its sensibilities, in the way that was just a kind of an alien world to me that I never really found a way to connect with. And I felt that Kill was much more in line with everything else that we've been talking about tonight. And I think, I'm fascinated to see what happens from Indonesia, and I'm fascinated to see what happens from India in the coming years, and see what else we get, because the ante keeps getting upped a little bit.
Exactly. I mean, I think for sure, like when it comes to films in general, I think when it comes to like the country of origin, or geographically speaking, like we have like it's an Indian action film, like as most people would say, or it's an Indonesian action film, but I find that they complement each other very well. Like regardless of where it's from, I just personally, when I watch a film like this, or like a couple of these films, I don't tend to see it as, it's an Indonesian action film, or it's an Indian action film. I tend to see it as more like it's just a badass action film. Like it's just action in general, or within the genre, right? Because it's a lot about our characters like being immersed in the universe, right? And I remember seeing Kill at the Toronto International Film Festival last year for the first time. And it was actually very serendipitous, because I was actually going to see Boy Kills World. Right. Initially, I wanted to go see that, but because of my schedule, I remember lining up to wait for tickets online. And when I was able to get in, it actually pushed me to go see the screening for Kill. So I was like, this is kind of random. I was just like, I actually was initially going to see Boy Kills World, but I had no idea what Kill was about. All I remember seeing was just a picture of this guy. I think he was like a SWAT guy, or a commander, of the military. And like you see a bunch of the knives being pointed at him, kind of like the John Wick effect, right? And so I was like, all right, this is something that's a little bit up my alley. Let me try it. And so I remember going to the premiere on that day, and just being in the front, and it's a bit slow, as you might notice from the beginning. But once that title card dropped, halfway through, or in 20 minutes in, locked in the entire time. And I remember when the director Nikhil Nagashpat actually came out, as well as a couple of the cast members, they went to talk about the film, right? And a lot of their influences was actually from, I think I heard correctly, John Wick and The Raid. And they did get the choreographer Brent Chan from Snowpiercer to do some of that work too.
Yeah,
but
the choreographer's also from Korea.
Yeah, right? Exactly. And so a lot of I think the intention of Kill was to not just, make it as a mark of, like the first time the Indians doing an action film like this, but it's more so about how they use the history behind the director's kind of his experience being on trains and how there are always thieves on there. So that's kind of his own personal, I'd say, extension of his experience, but also kind of being like a boy in his country in India and, experiencing thieves on a train, but also taking international influences from different cinema. And he even mentioned like stuff from like The Villainous and, a whole bunch of stuff from The Raid. So I think, as you've mentioned, like the influence of Indonesian action films have definitely touched upon other types of films from other countries, right? And it ends up being very complementary with one another. It's kind of like, well, Kill is kind of like John Wick and The Raid's baby in a sense, as most people often say it, right? And so, but in another way, it kind of stands on its own, right? Because I find that sometimes films, they tend to be like, we refer them to like, oh, this is like a John Wick spinoff, or oh, this is kind of like The Raid, in another format. But in the end, it's kind of like, it's actually its own universe when you come to think about it, right? Yeah. And so I find that oftentimes the action films in general, I find that it's often the genre that kind of puts it together as a whole, right? But when we're geographically speaking, then it's kind of like when you start to look at the country of origin and how maybe even the martial arts of that country is being put into these films. So I find that's very interesting when it comes to that aspect. So it's not always, at some point it's like, yeah, this is an Indonesian action film, but I just kind of look at it as an action horror, action cinema in general. But, all in all, I think they're just so complementary with one another. And it's just so nice that you can bounce off of each other and you're just like, oh yeah, that scene is just so relatable with like a scene from another film, right? Or from like John Wick, right? And so you also see some of these actors going into the John Wick series. I think it was in John Wick 2, 3, I can't remember, but you see Yayan and Chacha playing the assassins, right? So you see how influential they become. I think also, I think it was she was the Japanese actress in, was it John Wick 4? Rina, I think. Her stunt double was Seori, so the girl who plays in Baby Assassins, right? So you see how their work from, the films that they've kind of taken themselves to go to Hollywood, right? So I find, it's such a nice thing to see and to notice when you realize that, oh, these guys are actually from The Raid. You're just like, oh, I see Mad Dog on screen or something like that. So I think it's a very cool aspect.
For those of us who are kind of fans of action, I think we are definitely kind of in a little bit of a minority compared with the sort of the great masses who watch a film, and I think that's why The Raid and John Wick often get used as almost as a kind of like shorthand seal of approval to try and tell people who aren't necessarily, because you're really familiar with all the actors and the choreographers and the filmmakers involved, right? Because you're a fan of this sort of stuff. You can live and breathe this stuff. But I think for the regular audiences, I know that's why people will kind of use, oh, if you love John Wick, you'll love this.
Yeah,
and
that's understandable.
Yeah. And it becomes this sort of shorthand to sort of try and entice people who maybe wouldn't necessarily check out a movie that wasn't from a country they were familiar with, or it almost kind of gives I don't want to say seal of approval, but it's almost just like a way of trying to kind of bring in more audience people into it. And it's something that kind of critics and reviewers have always done, right? I always remember, this is another tangent, but when the Jennifer Lopez movie The Cell came out, which I have a little bit of a soft spot for, I don't know if you've seen The Cell, but
I don't think I've seen it.
It's not a great movie, but it's made by a phenomenal director called Tarsim, who's the production design in his movies is unreal. Like his movies look so spectacular, and without me planning it, but he is Indian, but he's an Indian who's making movies in Hollywood. And he made The Fall, which is also absolutely beautiful, and he made Mirror Mirror, which is like his sort of take on the Snow White story, and he made The Immortals. And anyway, when The Cell came out, The Cell was about this really goofy script about this serial killer who's abducted somebody, and then he has a stroke and goes into a coma. And so he's got someone who's abducted is trapped, and they're in a tank that's slowly filling with water. So if they don't basically find out where he's left this person, they're going to die, right? And the only way to find out where she is to travel inside his mind through this crazy little bit of technology that Jennifer Lopez is like a psychologist, so she has to wear this wacky suit and link minds with him and go inside the mind of a serial killer, and she gets to explore. So it just basically creates this opportunity, because you're inside someone's mind, for the most incredible wild visuals and amazing costumes. And anyway, because it's a sort of serial killer movie, the tagline that originally was on the poster when I went to see it when it first came out was, "This is 7 meets 7 for the post-7 generation." And it was like, wow, okay. And it was like a crazy way of like trying to say, if you liked 7, if you really, really liked 7, give this a chance, right? And I think, and I did really, really like 7, and I gave it a chance, and it was pretty good. But I think it's something that we've always kind of done, and I think there's part of me sometimes rails against it, and I get a bit bothered when everything's compared to John Wick. Because it's been so successful. But I think I ultimately try and like take a step back from myself and be like, it's cool, don't take it so personally. If it's a way of getting more people to see that thing, then it's cool, right? And I think the same thing sort of applies here. And I think it's strange that like streaming is slowly starting to get into this place where the streaming companies are actually now starting to really create really worthwhile contributions to the genre. And I think The Shadow Strays definitely qualifies. The Night Comes for Us was another Netflix exclusive. Netflix has picked up all the later Rurouni Kenshin movies from Japan. So they're now they keep them all locked down. We were just talking about Kill, and Kill's been like picked up by Amazon. So it's now impossible to buy on physical media outside of the States because Amazon won't allow it to be sold. So it's a double-edged sword where I'm really glad that we're getting this content, but I'm less glad that it's being held behind this paywall of a streaming service. But I think it's just going to be really interesting to kind of see how it unfolds. And I'm really interested to see what else this does for Indonesia, and particularly for the other filmmakers who are from Indonesia who are going to be inspired by what Timo has done and his incredible success. He's apparently remaking The Train to Busan as well. As The Train to New York, so it's going to be another American-based film. And Kill, that we've just spoken about, is also apparently going to be getting a remake, because Lionsgate bought the rights to that before it even came out. And that is something that I'm a lot more skeptical about, because although I know you said you don't always view these as being an Indonesian or an Indian movie, but there was elements to Kill that are really ingrained in Indian culture for me, and I don't know how transferably well that would be.
I see.
Like, I don't just think you could transport that to the States and try and tell the same story. Because we've sort of seen that story. It was Under Siege 2 with Steven Seagal, and that story was not good. Like, that was not a story I enjoyed.
For sure, I understand, for sure.
So I would much prefer that the money got funneled back into these countries rather than it necessarily being, let's take that product and remake it. That said, I'm happy to see if Timo remakes Train to Busan for an American audience in America. I'll go with it, but I would much rather kind of see the industries in those countries kind of grow more and have more opportunities to make more stuff. Because I think when they're unrestrained with the confines of it being a remake, and it can get to be original story, we get stuff like The Shadow Strays. I think, if we've said anything, I think we've both been taken by the characters that he's created and the world that he's created. Because it's something we've not seen before. We've seen action movies. Yes, we've seen action movies with female leads before, but we've never seen quite this particular flavor with these actresses. So I think it's a unique new contribution into a genre that we're both big fans of. That I can't get enough of, and I hope we get more.
Yeah, for sure. I think now that I think back, you're for sure. I agree with you, because now, especially when it comes to the action films in general, the ones that are international, right, as we've referred to throughout this chat, it really emphasizes a lot on, I guess in general, like, how does a character, how do individuals, how do they deal with consequences, right? And so you see how in our American films, right, and I always like to refer to the Jason Statham ones, because they're just so, they're always the ones where it's kind of like, well, you always have like our protagonists, they're invincible, right? And so a lot of these films, I think they tend to, the ones that we're talking about, Indonesian films or Indian films, it really, you get to see characters in their vulnerabilities, right? How do they deal with, close quarter combat, or how do they deal with themselves with tight spaces, right? And so, films like these, you get to see how characters, they're not always glamorous all the time. They're not like Superman. They don't have, supernatural powers, right? It's kind of like, well, I'm kind of dealing with things that are around me, kind of going back to Jackie Chan, right? So dealing with what's in my surroundings, how many people are around me, and just, fighting the hell out of every single person is kind of like, well, for sure, if you yourself were the viewer, if you're in that character's shoes, how would you also go about that? And better yet, like, what if you don't have martial arts skills, right? So I think the emphasis of these directors and filmmakers, it can be controversial for some individuals or for some viewers, where they're just like, yeah, there's so much gore, there's so much violence. Like, oh, why are you guys putting spectacle into this? But if we see it through a more critical lens, it's kind of like, well, sometimes it's how a director kind of views the violence, right? How do they want to portray that through their own subjectivity? But also, this is also part of the reality of violence too, right? In a sense of like, well, there's no such thing as there's not going to be blood occurring if, someone was to attack you, and if one person was more dominant than the other person, right, so to speak. And so I find that having characters who are, again, vulnerable in those situations, and being outnumbered in a sense, how do they deal with those types of consequences, right? And it's always the resolution, right? You have cause and effect, what's the outcome? And so I find that these films, they play that dynamic very well. And it really allows us to see that, whoever comes out on the end, they're never going to look the same as how we saw them in the first place in the beginning of the film, right? So it's kind of like that play between, like, again, cause and effect, and how do we as viewers kind of navigate through that world. And it's also kind of puts you on the edge of your seat too, because it's quite adrenaline running, right? And it's not comfortable to sit through, but that's kind of the reality that you're being brought into through this film. So it's kind of like you're going through that roller coaster with them.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's fascinating to kind of know how he manages to strike the balance, because I think the gore never goes, and I don't even really want to call it the gore. Let's just say the kind of the visceral nature of the effects. Never goes so far to a point where it becomes something that is kind of difficult to watch in a way where it's not something that kind of grosses you out, or maybe I'm just completely inured down to kind of seeing stuff. I don't think so. I can still occasionally see stuff that's kind of really, like when you see violence that's filmed too accurately, it kind of makes you feel a bit sick.
Yeah.
I always remember there's a thing in Mo Better Blues, the Spike Lee movie, where Denzel Washington's character gets hit around the face with his trumpet. And I think partly it's because of, like, you've watched this character struggle for so long to get to a place of, like, some sort of degree of success, and he's sort of got there. There's this random moment, and he gets hit around the face, and it really busts open his lip in a really graphic, awful way. Yeah. And because you're so invested, or I was so invested in the character, by the time we got to that stage, I just felt physically ill when it happened. And that to me was that's what happens if you see violence happening on the street. Like if you see some random fight breaking out and something, occasionally, I'm from Scotland, so I do quite often see random acts of violence, unfortunately, happening. It did happen, less so now, but it used to be a big thing when I was a kid. It was a rougher, crazier place around here, because no one's got guns here, right? So if something happens, if there's an argument, then someone just throws a fist or a glass or whatever. So when you see violence in real life, it genuinely has a quite sickening quality to it that's really, I think, adrenaline just surges, and it's uncomfortable, even if you're not directly involved in it. And I think that's something that can definitely be achieved, and I think filmmakers like Scorsese are particularly adept at doing that, and some of the stuff that he's done. And if we think of kind of that scene in Goodfellas with Joe Pesci, the Am I Funny scene, I think that there's an unease to those sort of moments that's alarmingly close to reality. And I don't think Timo's doing that. So he's definitely firmly in the place of, he's giving us an action experience that is more grounded in reality than we've maybe seen in some of the other movies that we've mentioned over the course of the chat. And but he's striking this really interesting balance to me, where it's keeping you engaged, and it's keeping you entertained in a way that I'm thoroughly gripped by what he's doing. And I think on a kind of practical character level, when I think back at the film, the only times that 13 gets into situations where it's almost more than she can handle is when she's coming up against another female protagonist. or a 3-0 antagonist in one case. So when she comes up against the girl in the club, that's really the only person that kind of comes close to doing her any harm in that situation. And certainly when she has the fight with Umbra, she's kind of in a situation where you genuinely feel like she's fighting for her life at that point. Like, where if she doesn't kind of do the best of her ability, she's probably going to lose out. And that never is something that I kind of felt when she was going up against any of the guys in the movie, even when she was massively outnumbered. And I think that was definitely by design. It's kind of cool, right? Because that's, I think, the strongest characters in the Shadowless world would appear to be, with the exception of possibly Master, who shows up right at the very, very end. And I think certainly Umbra alludes to the fact that her own training was much more hardcore than 13's training has been because of him. And it'd be interesting to kind of see how that unfolds if he gets another chance to revisit the world. But I kind of like the fact that really the only people that had a potential to kind of best her were other female characters in the film, and that's particularly unique because certainly we have seen other kind of female characters in movies and other female characters in action movies, but we rarely see them as being the most dominant force in the film. And I thought that was pretty refreshing because it was a way where it never felt like it was being agenda driven. It was entirely character driven. It was entirely like these are just the best people in this organization. They just happen to all be women. And I think that there was certainly that other big, massive, huge guy who was the Shadow, who was crushing people's heads. But I didn't get the sense that he was necessary. He was just physically big. Yeah. But he was quite slow, and 13 was easily able to kind of like outmaneuver him. I mean, yes, it was a slightly worrying fight for a couple of moments. You realize like if he catches her, it's going to be trouble, but he just can't. Like she was running rings around him, and in a way that was kind of like a really nice. My hot water bottle's full. Oh, it was a really nice sort of like, I guess, like appetizer to the main course that was the fight with Umbra. So and it also put you into a position where she's a little bit more beat down before she spent the whole movie getting progressively slightly more beaten up over the course of what she's doing. So by the time that she gets to Umbra, she's not really even like the 13 that we saw in the first beginning of the movie. She's really beaten apart and still kind of like has been so ravaged over the course of the multitude of action sequences we've seen her in. So it's not even like Umbra's getting her at her best, and that raises the stakes so much more. We're kind of having to kind of see her fight for her life when she's already fighting at, I guess, what, 10-20% of her abilities had she been well rested and fully medicated up, which to me was really, really interesting. And I think maybe a slightly unfair advantage because I think I've probably seen this movie a bunch more times than you've had a chance to. So I think I'm up to about 7 now.
Oh, wow.
I can't get enough of it. I was kind of doing work before we had to chat today, and I had it just literally on beside me, and it's partly why my work took so long because I was meant to be editing on one machine, and I was kind of watching like I had Netflix playing beside me, so I kept finding myself my editing was getting slower and slower and slower, and I was just watching the film more and more. And at a certain point, I had to stop because like, okay, this is counterproductive at this point. So yeah, I find I'm getting sucked back into it all the time because it's immensely rewarding. And I think at this point I'm now at the level where I'm looking at the production design and I'm looking at kind of what they've done to stage scenes and wondering how they've done it with so little money. But none of that was evident on my first few watches. I was just watching the action, but I think you get more into it the more you watch. So I hope it's something that you'll revisit again and again and again and again over the years. I'm sure you probably will.
Yeah, I think when you started to mention like how Agent 13, she starts getting more beaten down, it kind of made me think of how like, the fact that we see her as, a complete like unstoppable assassin in the first sequence, right? And up till her fight with Umbra, I think it was like near the end when Umbra kind of, she dies, she starts to mention her actual name. It's kind of like this dynamic of, seeing her as just a number, right? As Tigablas, right? And how she becomes much more human near the end, right? Like she's actually she's outside of the world, right? And I think that was a very interesting, or maybe it was like a thing that Timo, I'm not sure if Timo wanted to do that. I'm not sure, but
I think so. Me, I almost saw it as also being a transition slightly from you realizing that she's not just been an instructor, she's kind of also been surrogate mother too.
Exactly.
And that there's kind of like there's a whole extra weight to that relationship.
Exactly.
We kind of only really find out just how deep it's been in that sort of last reel, in that last act.
Yeah, and we can also see too, I think it was I can't remember his name, but there was another actor who, the one who drove them, right? I think he shot Umbra too, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like how she kind of broke free from the what she was meant to do. He was just like, oh yeah, just finish her off. But you can see through her emotions that she didn't want to, right? But because she was trained to do what she had to, what she was instructed, right? So I felt that was definitely maybe a purposeful thing that they wanted to do, was just like, how the characters are becoming from numbers as they're portrayed as to becoming more human, right? So I thought that was a very nice play of the dynamics that they had. And so it's something that I think you'd have to kind of recognize as you watch it a couple more times, right? And you don't often see that, when it comes to action films. Like, well, I mean, you can see that the characters do have emotions, but the fact that they become like, assassins or killing machines in a sense, to more like how their characters start to, they lose that ability or those capabilities because of their strength or their, the versatility that they used to have earlier versus now. It's kind of like, this is the present state that they are at now, right? And so how do they deal with that, with the limited resources or the amount of people that they have around them?
Completely. And I think with Umbra, I was left kind of wondering if her own trajectory had been quite similar to 13's to a point, where how willing a participant in this program was she initially? Was she recruited in the same sort of way, where she was snatched as a child and sort of forced into this sort of indoctrinated servitude as trained to be a killing machine? I think sterilized through the medication. I kind of feel that was definitely, because I'm sure everything about that Volver scene was sort of alluding to the fact that they're basically being dehumanized and deprogrammed in a way, to the point where they're not questioning, which I guess, I think there's a bigger, without getting too needlessly intellectual about it, but there's a big argument about that of anybody who's in any kind of armed force profession, because the last thing you want from a soldier is you to say, go over there and kill that person or blow up that thing, and then to go, why?
Yeah.
But aren't they human too? Doesn't win wars very effectively, right? So I think there has to be an element of like, soldiers follow orders.
Right.
We do the mission, and that's everything in that first speech that Umber gives when they're in the car is all built around that kind of narrative of like, this is the life, right? This is what we do. And it's, I think even then, maybe because she's still quite early on in her career, 13 saying, but I am more than that. I have a name. And I kind of always got the sense that she can't remember her name at that point in the car, right? Until she stops taking, even really right up until the end, I kind of got the sense that she didn't really ultimately know what her name was until Umber told her. And reminded her of that and sort of unlocked that memory for her. And I think it's kind of really interesting that there's more going on than them just all being voluntary members of this kind of killing organization, which is more common. And I think we saw some of the same themes in The Night Comes for Us, where Joe Taslim's character was certainly had reached a breaking point with not wanting to be, and a similar kind of moment or sort of defining moment in each character's case. I think for 13, it was definitely, I think, when she shot the geisha, she killed an innocent, right? She killed someone she wasn't contracted to do, and she was kind of fine so long as it was part of the mission. But as soon as she she killed a bystander, effectively, somebody who was probably didn't want to be there in the first place. You got the sense that geisha wasn't super happy being there and performing for that kind of the Yakuza boss. And so I think that was the thing that started this first little planting seeds of doubt. And then when we see Umbra's mission in Cambodia, it's reconnecting with Volver, someone who, and I think Volver, I kind of got the sense that maybe Volver was like a previous, either classmate or possibly even a previous student, because she said, like, you used to look out for me, you used to protect me, right, and protect me again, like, don't do this, don't kill me, we can be more than this. And so that was what 13 had in the beginning, was almost this seed that was dropped in Umbra at that point. But Umbra still tries to stay on mission, stay on book. And so it's really only in that last little reel where she's kind of being forced to go up against 13, kind of against her will, I think, by the time that we get to the last reel. And I think that could have gone a very different way. And obviously we had to have an action sequence for the action film, but it gave it a little bit more of a sort of tragic, slightly more heartbreaking element to the fact that they're kind of fighting, but they didn't really need to be fighting because they're both probably largely the same. And I think, I just thought it was really, really well realized in a way that I love movies about these sort of dark worlds of particularly of hitmen, and it's something that I think I've been into since John Woo showed me Chow Yun Fat being super cool and The Killer, and it's always been the kind of world that we kind of enjoy seeing. And there's so many books and so many movies written about assassins in a way that's oddly really sort of attractive to us as an audience member, even though the whole concept of being paid money to go and kill other people is pretty horrendous and pretty horrific in real world terms, right? But there's something so engaging about that, people who've chosen that lifestyle, and then people who struggle with that, because I guess it makes them easier to empathize with as human beings, because they're struggling with the notion of killing people. But I don't know, I thought it was a spectacular kind of I think without throwing down too much of a mic drop type statement, but I do think it's the best film that Netflix have commissioned themselves to date, right? Because I'm not entirely sure if The Night Comes For Us was one that they commissioned. I think it was something that was made and then they picked up the distribution rights for. I might not be correct on that, and people in the comments correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was a completely Netflix funded film in the way that The Shadow Strays entirely was, where that's something the Big Four definitely was, but I think The Shadow Strays was entirely originated by Netflix getting it off the ground. And so by that reckoning, I think it's the best standalone feature film that I've seen them produce so far, or certainly the one that's resonated with me the most. And that's a really interesting place for us to be as fans of action as we are. So I'm trying to think if because there's a couple of scenes that we sort of jumped over quite quickly, but we have sort of mentioned in passing, and we didn't really get too much into some of our other supporting cast, because we've sort of focused on the ladies, rightfully so. But I do think it's maybe worth saying that I thought that the young guy who plays Jackie, Christo Emmanuel, was amazing too, in his own way, because he kind of started off as being pretty despicable and a member of the gang that you really didn't care what happened to him, but quite quickly gravitated into somebody who is becoming her ally, but still in his own way super conflicted. There's that beat when he sort of tries to hold her back when she's literally just stopped his grandma from getting killed by the cops, but he's still super conflicted and doesn't want to get himself in more trouble. And that wee dude is a huge part in the Big Four. If you get a chance to see the Big Four, he's kind of he is one of the four in the Big Four.
Oh, okay.
And I think the Big Four is his first sort of foray into acting, so he's still really quite early on. He's still super young, and in neither the Big Four or this, he doesn't have a spectacular amount of action to do. So I think I'm seeing him much more as a character actor. There's beats of action that he kind of gets reluctantly drawn in at various points, but I don't think he had the same amount of heavy lifting to do as the girls did in terms of the training and the choreography. But I thought he, as a pure character actor performance, I thought he was really good. And props have to go to our other villains, our other underworld seedy, nasty villains. So we should name them while we're here. So Agra Pilang as Haga, who is the sort of Jesus haircutted looking drug overlord who was running the club, and the sort of nasty prostitution get girls hooked on smack thing that he had going on in his club, and he was pretty grimy and reprehensible. His more I guess richer friend, the guy who's the son of the
Ariel, I think it's Ariel.
Yes, is Ariel, who's played by Andri Mashadi.
Always falling behind the dad, right? Always being the one behind his dad. They would always say. But
with his weird mask that he feels that he has to put on to, I guess,
Rey
to go into
looking thing, almost.
Yeah. And I thought he was also really despicable in a way. He again is in the Big Four, but he's got a really small part in the Big Four. He just literally plays a sort of blink and you'll miss him policeman. He's in a couple of scenes, but he's not really a big part. But I thought he was really pretty good here as being a really, really guy who you love to hate by the end of the movie. I was itching for him to kind of get his comeuppance because he was a massive piece of shit. I do think that the female kind of baddie on the I guess the grimy drug overlord side, Soria, who we mentioned before, we should name her. That's Tasca Namya. I wasn't too familiar with her from anything else either, but she did, again, on a character point of view, phenomenal as being somebody just really despicable, but in a way that was really manic. And there's a is that mainland China has been doing better and better with the movies that they're making for streaming, because they can kind of circumnavigate an awful lot of the restrictions that are in place for films that are going out at the cinemas in China. And so IQE has been pushing forward with making ever better action cinema. And hopefully you've had a chance to check some of them out. But there's an Andy O, I think it's Andy O, movie called Blind War.
Which I think I've heard of that one. Yeah, I've heard of that one.
Which, if you get a chance to see, do, because there's a female actress in that gave me slightly similar kind of response to the Soria character that we're talking about here, where there's a slightly demented, manic energy to their performance that's a little bit unhinged in a way that takes a certain type of confidence in your acting ability to pull off without it just seeming gimmicky or goofy. And I thought the girl that played Soria had that in spades. I think, as an aside, do check out Blind War if you get a chance, because it had for me the best sort of like almost Joker Harley relationship. It's not a Batman movie, but if when you do get a chance to see it, the villain and his girlfriend, if you kind of view them through a Joker Harley lens, that was my beat on it. And the girl who's playing the sort of Harley crazy sort of or Bonnie and Clyde, I guess, is maybe a more pro. They're just a pair of they're a couple and they're both crooks, right? So the female in that situation, she's phenomenal, and she's now started leading movies for IQE. She's just in a movie I started watching last night called Sniper that's way too CG heavy, but she's also similarly unhinged. I think I should tell you her name, because you might be like, oh yeah, I've seen her in 50 movies. I know exactly. Her name is my phone starts up. Her name is Yang Xing.
Yang Xing. I think I recognize it once you mentioned the name.
I think she's probably in her 30s. So I think she's been around for a while, but it's mostly all been supporting characters that she's played. But I think Sniper is one of her first sort of like ones that she's headlining. But really good and really kind of quite capable in action. But Sniper's not a great movie. Blind War is genuinely quite a good movie. Anyway, I digress. We also there was the cop, who I think is Troika.
Troika
or no, sorry, you're totally right. Yes, it is. It's Prosecco. Troika is someone different. In that case, then that was Adipati Dolken, and again, doesn't have as much to do as his other villains, but he led the charge on that plastic masked attack on Jackie's grandma's house, and I thought he was also thoroughly despicable, just mostly by the fact that he, I guess, represented the corrupt system, right? Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Much better said than I could. Yes, so he was the person who you would hope would do better, because he was basically part of the police, but he was so heavily corrupt and just basically doing absolutely nothing, which made it all the more understandable why 13 had to sort of take the law into our own hands, right, and go out to kind of try and save Monji. And Monji we haven't mentioned. Monji also amazing for a child, right? A child actor, even not just for a child, as an acting performance. He had to sell you on making that connection with 13 really quick, because and in a way that didn't feel forced or didn't feel ridiculous, and all from both sides. Like, it had to be, why would 13 put herself into this situation for someone she's just met? Right. But I absolutely went with it. Like, in terms of it wasn't really, even though we only really had two scenes, really. We had her kind of watching from afar and kind of seeing him have to look after his mum, because she was sort of drug-addled and a bit all over the place. And then after he's lost his mum, right, how he's trying to put on this sort of tough demeanor to the world, but still just a broken little boy. And I think how quickly they bonded. And I think the little note that he pushed under her door when he's already starting to call her sister was just like, I was went with it. It was kind of like my heart was melting a little bit. It was like, okay, yeah, totally, I get why she's going to go off and kill everybody in sight to try and kind of save this kid, because this kid is, in a way, her. She's also has this, as we will find out, has lost her mother at about the same sort of age, and I think just connected with this kid in a way that I just found totally believable. And I did see that as being a little bit of criticism, that some people were railing against it, saying it's ridiculous that they would connect so fast and that she would do all this stuff for him. I didn't get that beat at all. I kind of went with it, and a lot of that was, I think, for me, was kind of how charismatic that wee kid was, and how well the two of them played off each other in the very few scenes that they got to do, right? And we should name him too. He is Ali Fikri, and I think again also pretty much a newcomer, not somebody who's been in a bunch of movies before. He can't have been because he's very young. He's probably 12 or 13. But again, also, I mean, and tragically so, doesn't, again, heavy spoilers, those words, will once again be massive over the top of us, does not make it out alive, right? Doesn't make it out to the end. So I think despite all of 13's best efforts to kill absolutely everybody between her and him, she doesn't manage to ultimately kind of save him. And that, I think, was a wonderful, if you can call something like this, wonderful not cop out, right? Where I think it'd be too easy to be like, let's just give her a happy ending, right? They reunite. She's there with Monji. Cut to them eating meatballs and noodles at the bar, happy, and credits, right? And no, we didn't get that at all. So I think the movie kept me guessing at every stage as to kind of exactly where it was going to go. And I'm really glad that they chose the darker path. And reality in a way prevailed, and she wasn't able to save him, and it just fueled her fire even more. Right? So she was,
I felt like, in a sense, I think Monji, brought her back to Jakarta, right? It was kind of that sense of like that realization of where she came from, and that more the slums area, dealing with the underworld, the more realistic, I mean, it was more in the club scene, right? I think it was more in terms of those types of the underworld criminals, right? And versus when she was in Japan doing her job, right, as an assassin, versus here, she's becoming, again, she's expressing her vulnerability and how there are more, politics and corruption there, and how does she herself go against all of this, right? And when it's, completely impossible for one person to just do all of these things, but again, I guess with her training, with the support of Jackie, working as a part of that specific area in the crime underworld, kind of guiding her, and also Monji being that drive that she has to not only get out of that universe, but to kind of experience it herself, right, outside of the world of the shadows, right? Because it's more than just her training regimen. It's more than just, her instructor influencing her, but how does she deal with everything without the, I guess it's the supervision of people who monitor her in a sense, right? So how does she kind of make up her own decisions being quite young, and, dealing with the world around her with only the very limited resources and very limited amount of people, right? And so, I mean, I always tend to revisit that really small detail when she goes to that payphone scene, right? Trying to call and, trying to say, when's my next assignment, because I just want to finish it and just, get out in a sense, right? And being stuck in Jakarta, right? She's just that girl who's just like, I just want to do what I need to do, and I just need to leave and experience life, right? Or, just get out of that universe of being just a number, right? And so I found that a very moving scene in a sense, because it really spoke a lot about, you start to see herself kind of just, worry and, concerned and nervous about like, oh, if I don't have my next assignment, I'm still stuck here. And, I mean, she's always on her motorbike, but she's starting to see things, like she's seeing things that I think maybe she should not be seeing, but she's starting to realize that, oh, this is outside of my gear that I'm usually in, right? And I think that's when we notice her from afar, as you mentioned, noticing Monji taking care of his mother, and just kind of having that tie-in of the emotion, which I felt was very natural for us to see. I didn't really quite think that it was something that it should, that I found was wrong, but I felt that was something that was definitely very natural for her to kind of notice from afar, right? And it really helped bring her into, again, that universe of that she was not exposed to in the first place.
Yeah, completely. I'm glad you mentioned the phone booth scene, actually, because I would have forgot to bring it up, but there was these kind of really nice touchstones of her getting more and more frustrated at basically being kept treading water, kept in limbo in a place that she's not comfortable being, really, because she's kind of like, I guess, got this coiled spring, or kind of like a loaded gun, right? She's kind of has been trained to be this thing, and then is in a situation where she can't, and so I think she like loses her temper at one point, and then catches herself screaming at the operator, just being like, because the operator's just asking her the same shit every time. It's like, are you taking your pills? And she's like, fuck yes, fuck. And then
an automatic response, right? Yeah.
And then there's also a nice little kind of wee suggestion to there being more at play with those, and in a way, I guess. And I'm going to do that thing that I just railed against other people for doing, but in a John Wick way with the coins, the phone box kind of had a bunch of different things going on with it, because there was a way of her activating like panic mode, and then she could get a gun, right? Because otherwise we did get the sense that she was totally unarmed, that she's not Batman. She can't go and open up a wardrobe and there's all her amazing ninja, super high-tech ninja kit, right? She doesn't have any of that when she's there. So I think there's a vulnerability to being stuck in that environment without any of her things that she's been sort of trained to use, and we've seen her being so adept at. So I think when she was able to kind of punch in a sort of emergency panic code and get like a 9mm gun out of there, I think was a nice little allusion to that there being more going on with the Shadows world. Because I think without these little bits, although they don't seem like massive scenes at the time, there could be a sense of being like, is the Shadows just her and Umbra? Are there more? Is it just them and that slightly annoying old guy who keeps relentlessly talking English, even though everyone else is talking Indian? And like, what's his deal, right? So that kind of handler guy who ultimately kind of went against Umbra too, but we didn't really get a sense of there being a larger Shadows world until we saw Cambodia, and until we saw crazy lunatic 14. Who I'll see if I can find her name, because she was, I can. That was Maiwar Eva De Jong. And she was great too, with her fucked up teeth and her was desperate to sort of take 13's spot. But then, do you really want to be 13 unlucky for some, right? And I'm sure that's probably why 13 was 13. But it does mean we've got potentially other people in that. And on the number thing, I meant to say this before when you were speaking about the numbers. Not long after we first started, the idea of being I'm more than a number, I'm a human being. There was a really old TV show in the 60s called Prisoner, with Patrick McGoohan, which I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see. There's not that many episodes. It's like, I think that there's maybe a couple of episodes on YouTube, and if I'll send you a link. I'll see if I can find like a link to one or two of them. But Patrick McGoohan was a pretty successful actor in movies and stuff, and then he conceived of this TV series. And in the very first episode, you find out that there's this spy, like working for British intelligence, almost like, I guess, a James Bond style trope. But literally in the opening credits, you see him decide he doesn't want to do this anymore, and he quits, right, and hands in his resignation and goes away to basically get away. And you get a sense that he's going to go back home, and he's going to go off and travel the world, and he's just going to do whatever he wants to do. And the day that he quits and goes back home, he's drugged and falls asleep. And when he wakes up, he's stuck in this mental, strange village that's very unworldly, and he can't leave. Anytime he tries to leave, he's chased by this giant sort of white spherical thing that will catch him, trap him, and then he'll wake up again in the bed in his strange little village. So he can't ever escape this place. And he's given a number, so he's called number 6. And anytime that he tries to find out what his name actually is, because they've sort of fucked with his brain a little bit, he can't find out, but he meets other numbered people, and they're constantly trying to basically break him down, or break into his mind and try and discover the secrets that he has inside his mind, presumably from when he was a spy. And his sort of catchphrase throughout the show, because I think there's maybe only about 20 episodes or something in the season. It's super 60s and super psychedelic and kind of trippy. But he always says, "I'm not a number, I'm a free man," like throughout the whole thing. And that's his sort of mantra. And it's very kind of like, it plays on a lot of psychological themes. A lot of times when they're exploring the insides of his mind, and he's kind of going up against people, and he usually always bests the people that he's going up against, sometimes unwittingly. He doesn't even know that he's engaged in some sort of weird spiritual or mental chess match with people. But it's a trip of a show, and I kind of wonder, anytime I see that people as numbers thing, it always makes me think of that old show. And another one for your watch list at some point, because it's kind of a trip. It was pretty good, but not very action centric, but kind of goofy and funny, and the soundtrack's kind of funky now in a retrospective 60s kind of way. But yeah, so as is this case, so 13 wasn't just a number. She was a free woman and ended up being so, and is now joining forces with Master Burai, with Yaya and Ruhan, and presumably, hopefully, they're going to go and work their way from number 12 down to 1. I would
exactly.
hope that would be nice if we kind of get a chance to see. I think we've been going. I'd aimed for us to go for about an hour. I'm just looking at the time running now and realizing, with some degree of shock, that we're almost at an hour and 45. So I should check and see, is there anything else that you think that we've not covered? Otherwise, I think we will maybe wrap this one up.
Sure. I think the only final thing I'd probably mention, the only scene that, again, another captivating one, was probably the scene that she, I think it was Agent 13, when she started to poke out the eyeballs of Presteo, I think. That was very, like, I think for me, it was not just like a powerful scene, but that was kind of like where she was just done. I think she was completely, like, not only burnt out, but that was a scene that really spoke about, her emotions kind of on a rage, right? And just how much power she had at that moment. And I was like, oh my God, where did everyone else go? Like, she literally just poked his eyeballs out till it bled, right? So I found that just, oh man. I mean, that's what you get out of a Timo Tjahjanto film, but that was something that you would not expect. So I thought that scene was just very captivating.
Yeah, there was 2 brutal eye scenes. That was one. The other one was with the big, massive good, and he literally just grabbed them. That was rough. Where literally an eyeball popped out, and it was like, wow, okay. He's not shy. I think the eyes one didn't hit me as hard as the oil. I think the oil one, that was really, because I've burnt myself with hot oil before.
I see.
Never to that extreme, but a couple of tiny little spots, and it was agony. It took like weeks to heal. It was like, Jesus. So like a whole head's worth of oil was particularly brutal. But even the guy still came back after the first time. Plus, he was wearing that plastic mask that would have melted to his. Oh, dear me. Yeah, he's
quite disturbing, actually. But he was definitely one of those characters that had to be there.
Completely, yeah. And I think there's a legacy of that sort of thing in certain other movies. There's a Japanese movie called Ichi the Killer, based on manga, and I think it was also turned into an anime at one point, but been quite a long running manga called Ichi the Killer. And there's one really truly horrific burning oil scene in that too, which I saw when I was probably a bit too young, and it kind of gave me the shivers in an uncomfortable way. So this one kind of maybe flashed me back to that sort of period, but that was kind of one of the more brutal kills. But in that situation, really, she was kind of up against it and outnumbered and outgunned, and I kind of totally got that she was just doing that Jackie Chan thing. She was just using her environment to her advantage and grabbing whatever she could. And when there's hot oil on the stove, and what home doesn't have a giant wok filled with hot oil? I'm sure we often do here too. So I think that was grim. But the eyeball one was particularly graphic. And that whole scene, actually, that chase scene with her getting knocked off the bike, and as a way of kind of getting pulled back in, and then us not really knowing exactly what was going to happen to her. Initially, I was pretty worried that because now she'd been caught by Ariel, and Crazy Lady was there too, and was it going to go badly? And she was kind of there as like the sort of cackling hyena at the side, being like, "Don't kill her too quickly, so that I can kind of get a piece." And it was really the dad was the voice of like, "Wait a minute, you can use this incredible skill that she has and send her off to do our bidding." So that was it was a nice beat. Again, one that I didn't really see coming. I thought she was just going to find some way to escape that situation. I didn't kind of really see it. It was going to be this reluctant alliance of sorts of her having to kind of go along and help them with that the deal in the warehouse. And then that whole warehouse scene, we've glossed over. The warehouse scene was also what I felt a bit of a nod to Hard Boiled in a way.
A little bit. It definitely had that influence of Hard Boiled, like the industrial setting and the flames and the drug deals. But again, just to quickly go back to what you mentioned too, Dragon, when I think it was a lot of this play between her and order and chaos. It's kind of like, well, in the beginning, again, with the payphone scene, right? It's kind of like, well, she doesn't have instructions. What's she going to do now, right? She's still left in that vulnerable state, versus when she's in that little chamber and Ariel literally has the bat near her face about to, hit it off. And with his dad kind of coming in saying, oh, we could use her for, some of the drug dealing that they're going to be doing. It's kind of like order being at play. It's kind of like, well, this is her next set of instructions that she has to go through. it's not in the shadows world, but this time it's within the criminal underworld, right? It's kind of that play of that dynamic, and that she has to deal with order and, you know, autonomy in a sense, right? So that's that battle that she has to kind of go through, and that kind of helps her throughout the entire film. It's like, well, what is she going to do if she doesn't have a next set of instructions? Well, now she has to kind of find a way to free herself, right, in a sense, but also keep her individuality and her autonomy. So I found that was a very interesting thing that you pointed out, for sure.
And kind of you highlighted it in a way that I didn't kind of too, where I think it is, that was in some ways that's a more natural state of mind for her, is to kind of be used to sort of following instructions. And so I think that was, maybe that's a beat that I didn't even kind of address, and I've seen it a bunch of times. I didn't make that connection. I kind of just saw it as being sort of the only way to save Monji, but I think on another level it was probably a very a comfortable, or maybe not comfortable is the wrong word, a familiar arrangement, right? Of kind of you having to do the instructions or doing the biddings of people you don't necessarily like, but that's just the way of the world for her up to this sort of point. Yeah, totally. And I think kind of the breakout kind of happened, I guess, in the midst of that, was that her main next point of rebellion against that group was after she finds out that Monji's been killed, right? And so then it becomes kind of like she goes into like berserker mode again, in a way that was kind of really very different to the stuff that we'd seen before. And I think he started using an awful lot more slow motion, particularly with hyper slow motion when you were seeing the rocket launching and stuff, which was pretty cool. And I don't often see RPGs used in that sort of situation in that many movies, and that was kind of quite unexpected too. She'd apparently also had to learn how to like stunt drive. And another crazy fact was that it's apparently not safe to have airbags in those situations. So it's weirdly safer for them to remove all the airbags from the car, because the cars are hitting into things, and otherwise the airbag would go off and people can get concussions and stuff. So weirdly they're driving cars with less safe security protocols, because that's safer for collisions, which was nuts. So her having to do all the sort of stunt skids and turns and stuff and crashing into the other cars, all totally her, I think, which is wild, because I don't think she could drive a car before they started doing this, and she definitely couldn't drive a motorbike. So I started following all the Instagram accounts of most of the cast, and you can see she'd post clips of herself going out on like a tiny little moped for the first time, and then it's a pretty big bike that she's gunning around in that movie too. So I'm very intrigued to see what she does next. I'm sure she can conquer the world, right? But I think it'd be nice if we see her continuing to sort of flex that little bit of kind of that action itch that I hope that she now has for making these sorts of movies, because she's a really interesting, very strong, and really compelling actress to watch, right?
For sure.
Same with Umbra too. I thought they both did a really good job of being extremely watchable. Not always the most likable in Umbra's case, but still always really intensely watchable. And I think her speaking Japanese at the beginning all came apparently because Umbra's fluent in Japanese, so that's kind of why she got all that dialogue, and that kind of her interacting with the Yakuza guy. And there's one other thing before I forget: the whistle that they mentioned at the beginning. Right. That's all lifted straight from Lone Wolf and Cub's comics. So that's a big part of Lone Wolf and Cub. And I think they literally just reference slight panels. And the way that Umbra picks her up and you see the flashback back to her as a child, again, straight panels, direct kind of homage to Lone Wolf and Cub comics. So he's pulled from a lot of different things that he clearly loves, and I'm sure we're going to find many, many more of these little things as time goes on, as people make more of connections. But that whistle thing is that's 100% straight out of the pages and the writing from Lone Wolf and Cub, which is pretty wonderful to see used in another film and make that connection. But just what an absolutely incredible movie, and I certainly hope that anybody who's made it to the end of our chat has seen The Shadow Strays before they've started. But so I would maybe not say make sure you've seen The Shadow Strays, but I would say to everyone watching, go and watch The Shadow Strays again, right? Get those Netflix stat numbers up, because the more people that watch it over a longer period of time, the more chance we have of them giving Timo some more money, because goddamn Netflix can easily afford to give him another $4 or $5 million to make another movie like this. And hell, give him 10, right? That's still a drop in the ocean for most action movies. I think it's crazy how much he was able to do for how little, and I think we will definitely if you're willing. I would love for us to do this again for once you've watched Baby Assassins 2 and 3, and let's do a Baby Assassins super chat, because I've had an absolute blast. I hope you've enjoyed too, and you've raised a whole bunch of stuff that I had not thought about when I was watching this movie, and I've seen it multiple times. So it was really interesting hearing your perspective. And thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Dragon. It's such a pleasure just to share the excitement and the passion. I could definitely tell that, aside from, you watching this film many times, that you bring out so much of the features of it too. And I think it's very nice to have this conversation to allow for other viewers to, like, whether or not you've seen it or you haven't seen it. I think there are spoilers here and there, but it's always good to have, I guess, other perspectives into play. And I always say this to other individuals too, like, obviously the things that we often point out is not going to be agreeable, and that's okay, because I'm of course I'm not a film expert, but I'm just coming from an audience perspective. And so I think it's always enriching for not only myself to just learn from you, but also for just film in general, for just everyone in general to just kind of say, oh, I never thought of it in this way, or like, this is something I just learned. So definitely these are the kind of conversations that I do enjoy and that really do help me to kind of see certain films in the genre kind of evolve and transform, right? Because it's always subjective to the viewer, but it's always nice to hear another perspective from another viewer, right? Because they complement each other. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Dragon. Thank you.
My pleasure, and I think I never say that I'm an expert. I always just say I'm a fan. I mean, that's kind of why my channel's called what it is, right? I'm fanatical about the things that I like, and so I think it's cool. It's one of the best things about it is, in fact, the best thing about the internet for me is the fact that we can do this, right? We can be at other sides of the world, and we can kind of get together and just talk about something that we both really enjoy. And I think that's when the internet does what the internet does best, is when it can bring people who have similar passions and similar interests together to talk about a thing. And I hope for anybody who's made it through and watched this with us that they have kind of found something that's made them think about a scene or something else, because we've jumped around a bunch of other things too, and I'm really glad that we have, because I think it's nice when these chats are really free flowing. So hopefully people have enjoyed listening to it as much as we've had having it. And I think I will say, now that we're at the 155 mark, I will say goodbye to everybody watching. Please, you also say goodbye.
All right. Thank you so much, Dragon. And once again, I'd like to say hello and goodbye to any new viewers here. I look forward to seeing you, whether or not that's on the DSP channel or even back to the Fanatical Dragons channel.
Yes, and I will leave this at my final parting shot of saying, if you didn't already, when I told you at the beginning, please jump over and subscribe to Dragon Seek's Path channel, because it's fantastic, and you do really, really good long-form videos, which took me ages to start building up the confidence to do, right? And you've kind of jumped in from pretty early on, just with quite raw, unfiltered, complete passion and enthusiasm, and that's the most infectious thing, right? So I would encourage everyone to jump over and subscribe to your channel if they have not already. Link is underneath here, and hopefully we will get a chance to do this again sometime before too soon. Maybe at the beginning of 2025 we shall kind of come back together, or maybe in fact we should do it just before Chinese New Year, right? We should do it because we're in Year of the Dragon just now, so we should say goodbye to Year of the Dragon just before we move into the next new year. So we can maybe do our Baby Assassins super chat as a goodbye to the Year of the Dragon from two dragons.
Sure, yeah.
That'll work nicely. There's a nice symmetry there.
Definitely.
Cool. In that case, I shall say goodbye. You will say goodbye.
All right. Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.